It is my pleasure to welcome everybody to today's CCNB seminar meeting. As everyone knows, in this semester, the seminar meeting is under the topic control. And today we are very excited to have Steve Fleming joining us online to give a talk on metacognitive control of information seeking. I mean, Steve Fleming is very well known for his work on metacognition processes. Many people will know him. He is group leader at University College London. He had big famous fellowships and is having a professorship there for cognitive neuroscience at UCL. And so we are very happy to have him here today, online joining for giving this talk. We have the normal housekeeping as usually for the talks. We are having a talk of around 40 minutes. Then we have questions and answers for the people who are joining online. Then raise your hand. We will only record the talk as such. So welcome to everyone here on site and everyone online. And Steve, the stage is yours. Looking forward to your talk.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much, Timo, for the introduction and for the invite. It's really nice to be with you. So I'm going to start off with a little story. So this is the story of Stanislav Petrov, who was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces in the 1980s. And this was the height of the nuclear tensions during the Cold War. And he was on duty one morning, and he was in charge of monitoring these early warning satellites that told the Russians that they were under missile attack. And the doctrine at the time said that he had to pass that information up the chain as fast as possible so that a preemptive strike could be launched. Now, what Petrov did on that morning is, rather than pass it up the chain, he paused and decided that what he was saying was likely to be a false alarm. And of course, he was proved right. And as this Guardian obituary suggests, he's perhaps one of the few individuals who can lay claim to being single-handedly averting nuclear disaster. So why do I tell this story? Well, I think it helps us reinforce the value of seeing the world in shades of grey rather than black and white. Petrov was able to reflect on what his senses and his systems were telling him, and to entertain uncertainty about whether this alarm was real or illusory. He was able to entertain uncertainty about whether the information he was being told was true or false. And more generally, he was able to distinguish appearance from underlying reality. And we know this is not an easy thing to do, as Plato famously illustrated in his analogy of the prisoners in the cave. The shadows on the wall are being perceived as what is real, even though they're not reflecting underlying reality. And more generally, as we know from experimental psychology, the brain is engaged in building a model of what is out there. This is one of my favorite demonstrations from the British psychologist Richard Gregory, his hollow mask illusion. I'm sure many of you have seen this. And what this is showing is a human face rotating in 3 dimensions. But what most people see is that as the mask turns around to the backside, you see the concave mask as a convex face popping out towards you in 3D. And the explanation here that's usually given is one in terms of the strength of priors over 3D faces overriding other cues to depth. More generally, what the point of this example is just to illustrate the idea that the brain is building some kind of model of what is out there, and that this is similar to how a scientist is also building models of their data. And imagine a climate scientist building a model of the Earth's weather systems. It's trying to approximate the underlying reality. And what this means is that sometimes these models can go awry. They can become distorted. They cannot reflect what is going on in the world. This underpins this famous quip from the statistician George Box: all models are wrong, just some are useful. So I think this is quite a useful analogy for what the brain is doing. The brain is mostly building useful models of the world, but sometimes these are misleading. And we know this from various sources. The case of hallucinations and delusions are plausibly cases of this model building process going awry. Cases of false memories, where people can be quite easily misled into remembering things in their childhood that never really happened. In cases of conspiracy theories, where people go beyond the data to see patterns that are not really there. So the question that underpins a lot of my research and that we've been working on for the past couple of decades now is, okay, how then, given these potentials for failure and misperceptions and misapprehensions of reality, how can we recognize when we might be wrong? Do we have insight into these distortions in how we see the world? And this question has a long history. I won't go too much into detail into the philosophy here, but philosophers have long speculated about whether true introspection is possible. Can we gain knowledge of ourselves? Comte famously said you can't, because there's this kind of problem of recursion. The brain is a single organ. You can't use it to introspect on another mental process. Whereas John Stuart Mill exchanged letters with Comte on this issue and came to a slightly more prosaic conclusion that we can just think of self-knowledge as being the application of regular psychological mechanisms to our own thoughts, behavior, and feelings. So he says here, we think about what we've done once the act is over, but with the impression still vivid in our memory. And this simple fact shoots down Mr. Comte's entire argument. And more recently, this idea from Mill and others have recurred in the writings of philosophers such as Dan Dennett and Doug Hofstadter, this idea that the human mind is particularly adept at recursive thinking. It can apply the same mental operations to its own thoughts, actions, feelings, behavior, and so on to build up this recursive model of itself. And as Timo mentioned, this is the broader umbrella topic of metacognition research. Humans engage in metacognitive reflection about our percepts, about our memories, about our decisions and beliefs. It seems as though we have some kind of internal check and balance on the accuracy of these other aspects of perception and cognition. We can stop ourselves and think, hang on, is what we're seeing here real? We can think to ourselves like Petrov did, perhaps this is a false alarm. So the question then is, can we start getting a handle on, using the toolbox of cognitive neuroscience, how metacognition is working? Can we study it in the lab? Can we understand a bit about how it works? And can we perhaps understand how it goes awry in cases where you might lack insight into various mental phenomena? So what I want to do in today's talk is it's kind of a talk of two halves, really. So the first half is going to be on how we can measure metacognition in the lab, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of the results we've been getting on the psychological and neural structure of metacognitive judgments. This is more of a high-level overview. And then the second half is going to zoom in on the topic of this seminar series on control. And we're going to look at some work on the role of metacognition in the control of information seeking. Okay, so start then from studying a primer on measuring metacognition. So what we typically do in the lab when we're interested in metacognition is ask people to make two judgments. The first one we call a type 1 judgment because it's something about the world. So you might ask in, say, a perceptual decision-making context, which way is this patch of dots moving, to the left or to the right? That's a type 1 judgment about the stimulus. But then we can also ask you a metacognitive question. We can ask you a type 2 judgment to rate or evaluate how confident you are in that type 1 decision about the world. Now, when we have a whole bunch of these type 2 judgments over time, when we have many trials in a task like this, then we can start to build up a statistical picture of how the type 2 judgment, the confidence estimate, is tracking the underlying objective performance. So if intuitively, if I have higher confidence when I'm right and lower confidence when I'm wrong, then I can be ascribed a high degree of what we call metacognitive efficiency. So how effectively you are able to introspect and monitor your own performance. Importantly, all in the absence of feedback. So a lot of metacognition research is done in the absence of any kind of feedback so that we can just isolate people's subjective judgments about whether they themselves think they're getting the answers right or wrong. So this is now that's the idea. Here's some actual data. So this was a study that I ran years ago now, where we asked subjects to decide whether the first or second interval first or second screen here contained a slightly brighter grating, and that grating could appear at any one position around the circle to make it more difficult, and it either appeared in the first or second interval. So your type 1 judgment was first or second interval, and then your type 2 judgment was to rate your confidence on a scale from 1 to 6. And what I'm plotting here is the first few trials from a single subject of the raw data from this experiment. And the top row is the accuracy of their type 1 judgments, so whether they're correct, a 1, or incorrect, a 0. And the bottom row is their confidence estimate from trial to trial. Now, one important thing to note here is that in a lot of these experiments, we're adjusting task difficulty on the fly using an adaptive staircase procedure. So if you are performing well, then the staircase will make it a little bit harder. If you're performing badly, the staircase makes it a bit easier. The goal here is to try and iron out differences in performance and make everyone make a certain number of errors so that we can then isolate how good they are at monitoring whether they're right or wrong. But what I always find striking about just eyeballing these data is that even though the stimulus is constant from trial to trial, roughly speaking, and the task is the same on every trial, you still get quite wide fluctuations in confidence. Some trials, people are very confident they got the answer right. Other trials, much less confident that we were correct. So the natural question is, well, does this have any meaning? Do people actually know when they're right and when they're wrong? And that's really the core question in a lot of metacognition research. And a lot of the development here has been in the tools we have available to measure this quantity. And one of the most popular methods now is known as the meta-D prime model. This is an extension of signal detection theory. And so the way it works is that we use ROC analysis to quantify the overlap between two distributions of confidence: the distribution of confidence you give when you're correct in green, and the distribution of confidence you give when you're incorrect in red. And again, intuitively, if those distributions are more smushed together, more overlapping, you're less able to tell apart your own correct from incorrect decisions. Whereas if they're more separated, then you're in better shape metacognitively.
Yeah, hello.
Hello? What?
Yeah.
Hello? Okay, I'll crack on. So what we can do using this ROC is then fit a model to it, which is an underlying signal detection theory model that returns as a parameter meta-D prime, which is higher when the ROC area is bigger. But the nice thing about fitting meta-D prime to these data is we can then, it's in the same units as D prime type 1 D prime, to D prime on the primary task. So then we get some summary statistics which can characterize your performance on the task and your metacognitive ability in the same framework. So D prime is your performance on the primary task. Meta-D prime is how effectively your confidence is tracking your primary task performance. And then the ratio of these two is what we call metacognitive efficiency. And it should be around 1 if your metacognition is intact. The nice thing about this toolbox is that you can essentially apply it in any domain you like. So I've given you an example from a perceptual domain, but you can do this in a memory task, in a general knowledge quiz setting, in executive function tasks, IQ tasks. You can ask people to rate confidence in anything you like, apply the meta-D prime framework, and that can give you some quantitative metric of how good your metacognition is. So what does this look like in terms of the population statistics? This is what I'm plotting here on the x-axis here is log meta-D prime over D prime. So the optimal ratio here should be 0. So a log of 1 is 0. And what you can see is that indeed, in general, the average population metacognitive efficiency is as we'd expect, a ratio of around 1. This is pooling data over a number of different experiments that we've conducted in the lab. But we see some systematic individual variation here. So some people are on the right-hand side of this distribution. They're acutely aware of making good or bad decisions for the same level of D prime, whereas others have limited insight into their performance. And we see moderate test-retest reliability on this. So if I bring you back over 2 different days, then usually metacognitive efficiency is correlated around 0.6, 0.7. So when we can then ask some questions about the psychological structure of this parameter. So first of all, we can ask, does it have any generalized ability beyond a particular given task? This is a lot of the work we've been doing more recently, is trying to answer this question across a range of different tasks. So this was a first go at answering this question, which we built into this study from 2011. So we asked people not only to complete the contrast discrimination aspect of this task, but we also gave them a second task where now the type 1 judgment was not a contrast pop out, but an orientation pop out. Otherwise, it was identical. You had to rate your confidence in the type 1 decision. And we can then ask, well, does having good metacognition on task 1 predict having good metacognition on task 2? And what we found is that in this particular sample, so relatively small number of subjects, 18 subjects here, the performance threshold on the 2 tasks were uncorrelated. So just being good at contrast discrimination didn't make you good at orientation discrimination and vice versa. But we see systematic and pretty strong correlations in metacognitive efficiency and also confidence bias, how your overall confidence level across the 2 different tasks. So that suggests there's some kind of generality to this parameter that goes beyond mere first order task performance. Since then, we've done work in collaboration with other labs with bigger samples and using more fancy hierarchical Bayesian models to do inference on the covariance matrix underlying the association between metacognitive efficiency and the different domains. This is an example from work led by Audrey Mazantier in Grenoble. And what she did was ask subjects to carry out tasks in a variety of different domains. One was a perceptual task, another executive function task, another memory task, and general knowledge quiz. All have the same structure in that they required 2 alternative forced choice decisions followed by a confidence rating. And what we found was that there was systematic domain general components to meta D prime over and above any underlying correlations in first order performance. And we've seen a very similar thing in a recent paper from collaboration with Micah Allen's lab in Aarhus in Denmark. The innovation here was that very similar study, but now we used a staircase procedure in all 4 domains to make sure any differences in first order performance were ironed out before looking at that covariance structure. And again, we saw that if people have good metacognition on one task, they also tend to have good metacognition on another very different task. Just one note on this, because there's a bit of debate, there's a bit of insider debate about the extent of domain generality and metacognition. My personal view on this is that I think previous studies have tended to, including our own, have tended to underestimate the correlation structure here. Part of the reason for that is that in the old days, we used to just fit point estimates of meta D prime using maximum likelihood estimation. If you do that, then the fits tend to be quite noisy. If you then correlate 2 noisy parameters, you tend to return a correlation coefficient lower than the one that's actually underlying the data. This is all a simulation study here. Whereas if you adopt a hierarchical Bayesian framework like the one that we've developed, then you more accurately recover the generative correlation, including these higher correlation statistics. So adopting this is just a general lesson for cognitive science, adopting a more appropriate generative model can recover more structure in your data than you might otherwise have thought was there. What underpins this? There's lots of different speculation about what's the bottleneck, what's the general factor that might be contributing to metacognition. One interesting proposal here from, this is not our lab, this is Robbie Goris's work, Zoe Boundy-Singer and Robbie Goris at UT Austin. And what they found is, again, a domain general component to metacognitive efficiency. And when they fit this Bayesian model of confidence formation, what they show is that there's shared meta-level uncertainty over the uncertainty attached to different first-order cognitive processes. So the idea is that to have good metacognition, you need to know your uncertainty in different domains, physical, cognitive, mnemonic, and so on. And if you have some meta-level distribution over those uncertainties, then how precise your self-knowledge is of the control how good your metacognition is, and going to contribute to that domain general ability. Okay, so that's the psychological structure. I'll tell you a little bit about the neural side of things. So how do we achieve this feat of metacognitive judgment? So one broad, but I think quite powerful idea is that you can kind of think of 2 broad types of processing in the brain. One is more world directed. So you're trying to build a model of what is out there in the world. And the second is self-directed. So this is this notion that I talked about earlier, where the mind is recursive and able to take its own outputs as input for further processing. So if I see a stimulus like this grating, I can then entertain to myself, perhaps covertly, the hypothesis that it's tilted to the left. And then I can use that hypothesis that I've applied to the stimulus as input for further processing, further elaboration. So that's self-directed processing about propositions about the world. And it turns out, and I cover this in this annual reviews paper here, that just this one assumption about this transformation between world and self-directed processing is able to encompass all metacognitive judgments that psychologists have been interested in for the past few decades. So the key idea is that estimating our confidence in a hypothetical decision or action, so an action that we either have taken or will take on the world, unlocks this capacity to doubt ourselves, because confidence is this statistic that allows us to estimate the likelihood that we might fail. So how is this supported in the brain? Well, this was a study we did on this very early doors, pretty classical univariate contrasts using functional MRI. We had two conditions, one where people were asked to make this confidence estimate in a difficult perceptual decision. And the second was a low-level control condition where they had to just move the confidence slider to a particular point on the scale. The important thing here, though, is that in both cases, they're always making these difficult type 1 perceptual decisions. So it's controlled for that, that difference. And what we see is that when people have to engage in metacognitive judgments, we see elevated activation in two particular regions of the prefrontal cortex. The first, the dorsal anterior cingulate, and the second, the lateral frontopolar region. And these two areas, we see this crop up in a whole range of studies since then. But what's interesting here is that not only activating when you need to make a metacognitive judgment, they're also tracking how confident you feel about your decision on a trial-to-trial basis, showing this parametric relationship. So this was one of the earliest studies we did on the functional basis of metacognitive judgments. Knowing where things happen obviously is a useful starting point. It's not, though, at all an end point. We've since gone on to try and probe the computational role of these different prefrontal subregions. And one way we've tried to do this is by injecting new information on a trial-by-trial basis that people can use to update their confidence estimate. So rather than just having a type 1 decision followed by a confidence estimate, what we've done is add a new look at the stimulus after people make their decision, but before they have to estimate their confidence. And what this allows us to do is separate out this world-directed aspect of processing. So you make an initial judgment about the world. Are the dots going to the left or right? I then give you new information, and that's new information about my decision about the world that I've just made, right? So then I can use that new information to update how confident I feel about making that initial decision. And we can write down a computational model of this. Again, this has world-directed parts, so summing the evidence up over the two stimulus presentations to come to some posterior belief about the direction of motion, but it also has a self-directed part. So this is the part where I compare that summed evidence to the choice that I myself made to come up with an estimate of confidence that my choice was correct. So the nice thing about this kind of simple paradigm and simple model is that we can then extract out qualitative signatures of these different stages of processing. So in particular, if you just zoom in on this middle part here, this is a simulation of the impact of the strength of the post-decision motion, so the post-decision stimulus we show people on the x-axis on their change in confidence. What I should have also mentioned on that first slide is that the new stimulus we show is always helpful. It's always in the same direction as the first one. Okay, so we're not trying to trick you here. We're always providing you with helpful new information you can use to improve your confidence estimate about your original decision. And what this qualitative pattern is predicting is that as the motion strength goes up, if you were initially correct in blue, then I should just become more confident about my choice because that new information is confirming my initial choice. Whereas if I was initially incorrect in red, then as I get stronger post-decisional information, then I should decrease my confidence, right? Because that is now information that's disconfirming my original choice. So this interaction pattern between choice correctness and post-decisional stimulus strength is a qualitative signature of this new information processing in this post-decisional frame of reference, in this self-directed frame of reference. And what we find, to cut a long story short, is that in the brain, this dorsal anterior singular area shows this interaction pattern. But as we move forward in the brain towards the frontal polar cortex, we see a gradual shift from coding confidence in a world-directed to a self-directed frame of reference. So by the time you get around to the lateral frontal polar cortex, now you're coding for the update in the metacognitive judgment that people will make on that trial. We've also done similar work to try and isolate this more self-directed frame of reference when we can design, I won't go into the details here, but we can basically design a stimulus which decouples the uncertainty about the motion direction, so the uncertainty about the information in the random dot motion stimulus, from the difficulty of that decision. And when we do that, we find that the parietal and visual cortex is tracking uncertainty about the world, about the motion direction, whereas the prefrontal cortex is tracking confidence in this self-directed frame of reference, confidence about the decision I make about the world. And finally, we've done some work to show that these correlates of confidence in the prefrontal cortex are, to some extent, domain general. So if I give you both a perceptual task and then also a memory task, and I interleave blocks of those tasks, and then I use multivoxel pattern analysis to fit a classifier to predict your confidence estimates on the perceptual task data, I think I can then try and use that train classifier to predict your confidence in the memory task, even though that classifier has never seen any memory task data and vice versa. And if I can do that, then that shows that the voxel patterns in that region seem to track confidence in a reasonably general way rather than being task specific. And what we find is that in these, if you look in this panel here, these yellow regions, these medial anterior prefrontal areas show this more domain general coding of confidence, whereas the lateral anterior prefrontal cortex, these lateral frontopolar areas, show a more domain specific coding of confidence. There seems to be a kind of interaction, if you like, between these two different networks within the prefrontal cortex, coding from moving from just tracking performance in a relatively general way to tagging that information with whether the confidence has been experienced on one or other task. And we think that might be relevant for these more global aspects of task switching when I need to know my performance in order to choose what task to focus on next. And then just to end the section on the neural data, we can kind of circle back to think about the individual differences that we encountered it towards the start. Because if these networks in the prefrontal cortex are indeed involved in forming these metacognitive judgments, then changes in these networks should be able to start predicting differences in metacognitive efficiency. And that's indeed what we find across a number of different studies. We find that structural and functional variation within the prefrontal cortex, particularly variability in white matter connectivity and also functional connectivity between the medial and lateral frontal cortex, is predictive of individual differences in metacognitive efficiency. And perhaps most compellingly, when we've studied patients who have had these relatively rare lesions to the anterior parts of the prefrontal cortex, the frontopolar cortex, then we see a systematic drop in metacognitive efficiency relative to control groups who are otherwise matched for neuropsychology, age, IQ, etc. And so this is this group in the red bar here showing an almost 50% drop in this metacognitive efficiency metric on a perceptual decision-making task, even though all aspects of neuropsychology were intact. So just to summarize this first part, we've been able to isolate metacognitive efficiency from task performance by applying these methods that quantify the fidelity of confidence estimates. And this metacognitive efficiency component exhibits a domain general aspect, going beyond individual tasks. Effective metacognition requires representing your subjective uncertainty about decisions or actions you either have taken or might take in the future. And we think that that involves then this kind of recoding of information from representing uncertainty about the world to representing uncertainty about yourself, about your own actions. And we've got some evidence to suggest using functional imaging, but also some evidence from lesion studies and individual differences work that this posterior-anterior gradient within the human prefrontal cortex supports these more abstract metacognitive computations, tracking confidence in this self-directed frame of reference. Okay, so that's the first part. What I want to move on to is zooming in now on the role of metacognition in the control of behavior. And so far, I've talked about neural and psychological mechanisms involved in the fidelity of confidence formation. So really this kind of monitoring side of the coin. And now I want to turn to focus on the impact of metacognition on future behavior, on ongoing behavioral control. So one way we've been looking at this is all work done by a former PhD student of mine, Max Rollwager, was looking at how confidence in an initial decision you make modulates how you integrate new information that you're presented with later on. So the paradigm looked like this. People made an initial random dot motion decision, rated their confidence in that first choice, and then again, they got another look at that stimulus, again, always helpful, always in the same direction as the first stimulus, before being asked for a final decision about the dots. So a couple of details here. Again, we use a staircase underlying the first stimulus. So coherence of that first stimulus is titrated to target around 70% correct for each subject. As I said before, stimulus 2 is always in the same direction as stimulus 1, and it can either have the same coherence or slightly higher coherence in this particular study. So it's always useful to pay attention to that second stimulus because it can help you improve your final choice on the trial. And that's indeed what we see. We see people use that new information. So if we look at the accuracy of final decisions compared to initial decisions, people get better. And the reason they get better is that they tend to change their mind when they get new information that tells them that their initial decision was likely to be incorrect. So they're more likely to change their mind away from an initially incorrect choice than away from an initially correct choice. Okay. Now, what we're interested in, though, is the role of confidence in guiding those changes of mind. How does metacognitive estimates that you make halfway through the trial guide whether you are likely to go on to change your mind? Now, there's a bit of a wrinkle here because we actually want to isolate the impact of your confidence in your first choice on your future behavior. But we know from all our other work in metacognition that confidence is likely to be correlated with your performance on that first choice. So we want to try and decouple those two things. And the solution we had here was to use a psychophysical trick known as the positive evidence manipulation to dissociate performance and confidence. And I won't go into too much detail about this. We're using it as a black box. It's a nice little trick that if you're interested in, I can tell you more about, that we can change properties of the stimulus to make you feel more confident about your choice without actually changing your underlying performance. So we have two conditions here, low positive evidence, high positive evidence. We can look at whether this actually worked. Indeed, it did. So if we look at these two conditions, there's no difference in performance on the y-axis here, but there is a difference in confidence. People feel systematically more confident in the high positive evidence condition compared to the low positive evidence condition. And then we can ask, well, how does this impact, how does this injection, experimental injection of confidence, impact your changes of mind? And we find that it does systematically do that. And it does it in a way where if you increase your confidence via this positive evidence manipulation, that leads to a decrease in changes of mind. So boosting confidence but not performance leads to this reduction in changes of mind, and it's systematically correlated with the strength of the manipulation effect on confidence. So if you're a subject who experiences a big manipulation effect on your confidence, then you also tend to have the strongest reduction in changes of mind. So we wanted to ask, well, what's guiding this influence on a neural level? How is confidence guiding the change of mind effect? And again, this allows us to try and decouple the formation of confidence from the change in evidence underlying that first order choice. And to do that, we used MEG. So we adopted a machine learning approach to the MEG data here. So we entered the MEG sensors as features to train a support vector machine classifier all time points within the trial. And we did this both to predict whether your decision on choice 1 was going to be left or right, but also to predict whether your confidence was going to be high or low. So we just median split confidence, and then tried to predict how your confidence on each trial. Now, it turns out we can do this, and this is a plot of the classified predictions as a function of time from the moment the stimulus comes on the screen. This is all locked choice to stimulus 1. And we can do that both for your left versus right decision in red here, but also for your confidence estimate, and that's in gray here. But what was interesting was that it was only the confidence classifier that would go on to predict your later change of mind. So the stronger the prediction of high confidence in this initial phase of the choice, the less likely you are to go on to change your mind. So pre-decisional signals of confidence in this self-directed frame of reference predict changes of mind at the end of the trial. And that's not the case for the evidence classifier. So that again suggests that what we might be tapping into here with the MEG is this distinction between whether the evidence that we're tracking is something about the world or something that the subject is estimating about their own choices that they're about to make. Okay, so just a kind of interim conclusion on this study. So confidence shapes future information processing over and above objective performance. High confidence attenuates evidence integration, while low confidence promotes this openness to corrective information. And the implication there is that higher fidelity metacognition, so having better metacognitive efficiency, should aid this change of mind process, because it creates this open mind when you most need it, when you're more likely to be wrong, are the trials on which you're also less confident. So that's the intuition. We've also done some simulation work on this, or rather Max ran some simulations of this. And indeed, what we found is that if we compare various simulated agents making simple two-choice decisions, what we find is that having good metacognition can support actually a more frugal style of information processing. So if you have an unbiased agent that's processing all the information at every point of the trial, then that's shown in the red bar here. You do pretty well. But if you have good metacognitive efficiency, you can afford to essentially shut down processing information when you know you are likely to be correct, right? So when you've established, okay, I'm confident enough that I'm going to be correct here, I can then stop processing the new information, and that can actually outperform an unbiased agent, even though on the face of it, it's actually biased in its information processing. So we think this is quite an interesting phenomenon, that having good metacognition might help you actually be more efficient in processing at the first order level. We also have some empirical evidence for this. So this is, again, a different study that Max ran when he was a PhD student. This was a large online study with high numbers of subjects, hundreds of subjects. And what that allowed us to do was look at these individual differences in how metacognition was related to changes of mind in these kind of post-decision evidence tasks. So what we did is in a first task, we measured people's metacognitive efficiency. And then in a second task, we asked how the same subjects would take on board the new evidence to then potentially change their mind at the end of the trial. And we found that in two different studies, metacognitive efficiency measured in task 1 predicted adaptive changes of mind in task 2, again, suggesting that metacognition might act as this bottleneck through which people are able to then control whether or not they want to take on board corrective information. And then we can also do the same kind of we can also do the same thing, but now for a task where we allow people to actively sample the information post-decisionally rather than just passively view that post-decision information. And so again, the setup is very similar. People see some perceptual evidence. In this case, it was deciding which of two boxes contain more dots. They say which, they give their first order decision and a confidence estimate. And then we give them the chance to see the stimulus again, okay? And seeing the stimulus again costs them a small number of points, but it's adaptive to sometimes see the stimulus again because you're rewarded handsomely for this correct final decision. And what we find in this setup is that the confidence you have in that initial choice is predictive of whether you decide to see the information again. So the more confidence you have, the lower the probability of information seeking. But what was interesting about this study was that we also collected, again, a large-scale study that we ran over the web. We collected individual differences in people, the rigidity and dogmatism of people's beliefs by quantifying this with questionnaires about the tolerance people had about opposing political views. So what we were trying to do here is relate these kind of low-level properties of metacognition that we could probe through these psychophysical tasks to something about real-world belief formation. And what we found was a couple of interesting relationships here. So first of all, we built a regression model to try and predict on a trial-by-trial basis the likelihood that someone would say they want to see the new information again. And we entered predictors of confidence and information cost here. And then we allowed those regression terms, the betas in this equation, to themselves be influenced by the individual differences in dogmatism that we recorded from the questionnaires. And when we look at the posteriors over these individual difference effects, what we find is that for beta 0, for the intercept, we find in general there is lower baseline information seeking in individuals who are more dogmatic or rigid in their beliefs. So that's perhaps less surprising. People are just more unwilling to entertain opposite views, are just unwilling to seek new information, full stop. But perhaps what's more surprising, more interesting, is that we also found an effect on this confidence coefficient here. And we actually found this coefficient was less negative. So what this means is that because that coefficient is usually negative, there's a weaker link between confidence and information seeking in people who have more dogmatic or rigid real-world beliefs. And we can see that plotted out here. So on the x-axis here is the confidence people have in their first stage choice. And on the y-axis is the probability that they're going to seek new information. And what we see is that for people who are more dogmatic, they do sometimes have trials on which they say, no, I'm not very confident, right? So they do sometimes indicate low confidence, but they just don't act on those signals of low confidence to seek out new information. So the slope relating confidence to information search is weakened in people who are more dogmatic. We also see a similar relationship between what we call search sensitivity, so the slope of that relationship between confidence information search, and metacognitive sensitivity, so meta D prime. And this is both predicted from a theoretical model that my former master student Leon Schultz developed with Peter Dayan. This is a Bayesian agent, which is essentially trying to decide whether it's useful to seek new information or not, based on trying to maximize its reward. And it turns out that agents with better metacognition, as quantified by meta D prime, have higher search sensitivity. So this coupling between confidence and information search in this simulation. And we also see the same thing in the data. So there's, just like we saw earlier, there's this close link between having good metacognition and being able to use those confidence signals in order to adaptively guide behavior. And just to bring it all together, we also included similar questionnaires about people's belief rigidity, again, about real world issues, about politics, in this study that I mentioned earlier from Max. And what we found here was that when we looked at predictors of those, how dogmatic or rigid your beliefs were, using a variety of features of the task data, what we found was that the performance itself on the task in these gray circles didn't predict how dogmatic your beliefs were, but both people's metacognitive sensitivity and the extent to which they were willing to use those confidence signals to revise their initial choice were negative predictors of their belief rigidity here. So the more rigid or dogmatic their beliefs about these political issues were, the weaker their metacognition and the weaker their search sensitivity was in these low-level perceptual tasks. And this was replicated across 2 different samples. So the left-hand beta coefficient here is from a first study of 380 individuals, and the right-hand beta coefficient is a second study of over 400 subjects. So we think these are small effect sizes, definitely, but we think they're pretty reliable links between changes in metacognitive aspects of decision-making and how rigid your beliefs are about a range of real-world issues. Okay, so I just said that. And more generally, we think, this is perhaps a concern, because we also know from other work, this is work from Helen Fisher, that in particular knowledge domains, so she's done quite a lot of work on climate change, metacognition is particularly poor. So even if your knowledge is just as good as about climate change is just as good as your knowledge about, say, biology, you will have better metacognition on average about biology than you will about climate change. And we don't really understand the reasons for this, but Helen has speculated that this is potentially due to the fact that these areas are very polarizing and politically contested. And so people are just generally worse at monitoring the accuracy of their own knowledge in these more politically contested domains. And that could cause a real problem for when we're trying to promote people's openness to changing their minds and updating in response to new evidence. Okay, so I'm almost at the end. So where are we taking this next? Well, so far I've only told you about work that we've done on what we call local metacognition. So metacognitive judgments about individual decisions. With Marion Rouault and Sucharit Kaptial, we've been interested in building this out into a more global framework. So thinking about how people form beliefs about over longer timescales, and more generally thinking about metacognition as a dynamic hierarchical process that unfolds over a number of different timescales. And more generally, I think if there's one slide that could capture kind of the things that I'm interested in the lab, is to try and tap into experiments that can reveal something about human wisdom. So going all the way back to the urgings of the Greeks to the ancient Greeks to know thyself, to know what we don't know as well as what we do know, to always question our knowledge states, asking whether I know a topic well enough, or are we seeing things clearly enough? And there's a lot of focus at the moment, both on in AI in terms of developing machine intelligence, but also in educational sectors, developing human intelligence. I think we also should be caring just as much about metacognition and wisdom as well as raw intelligence. So I will stop there. There's a couple of books and my lab, and thanks very much for listening.